Madam President, we perceive today's meeting as a desperate attempt by the sponsors and puppeteers of the Kiev regime to keep the Ukrainian issue afloat in the Security Council at a time when the majority of the international community is objectively losing more and more interest in it. This is not surprising, since recently the overdue Ukrainian President Zelensky has managed to discredit the Kiev authorities to such an extent that only its accomplices, who inspired and supported the unconstitutional coup d'etat in February 2014, dare to express support for it today. As we all had a great opportunity to see, the main attempts of the former comedian recently came down to ingratiating himself with the Republican team that won the elections in the United States. Trying to shift the focus from the stake made by the Kiev authorities to the Democrats, Zelensky and his associates tirelessly travel around the United States and its main satellites with an outstretched hand, trying to enlist an understanding that the new administration will not cheat them. The sour expressions on the faces of the Kiev functionaries are largely explained not by the fact that it has not yet been possible to secure a new label for the rain, and not by the fact that they are informed about the inevitable reduction in military support, but primarily by the prospect of an audit of the American funds already spent on Ukraine. We have repeatedly warned that this is the most terrible scenario for the thieving Ukrainian authorities. Recently, it was confirmed, in fact, by the appointee of the new American president to the post of head of the FBI, Kash Patel, who intends to ask Congress to investigate where this money went. The American people need to get an answer to that question. How can we trust this government if we give such large sums and don't get an account of what they were spent on? He also intends to find out whether the president of Ukraine used false security threats to obtain financial assistance from the United States. It is noteworthy that both Western and the few remaining Ukrainian independent media are unanimous in their assessments that this check does not bode well not only for the Ukrainian supreme actor, but also for his democratic accomplices. It is not surprising that they made a serious fuss. Biden's national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, bluntly stated that the outgoing administration will do everything in the remaining time to provide Ukraine with all possible tools to strengthen its position on the battlefield. We are talking, as he explained, primarily about massive deliveries of military equipment in order to spend every dollar that Congress has allocated to us by the time President Biden leaves office. Recall that we are talking about the development of $6.5 billion. At the same time, as Western experts note, we are not talking about the real supply of weapons to the Kiev regime. It is almost impossible to do this in such a short time, but about the banal sawing of money and kickbacks, which the incoming Trump administration intends to stop. We advise everyone to stock up on popcorn. The fuss in this direction will be serious. And we will talk in detail about this whole situation and the key role of Western arms supplies and Western support in general in keeping the criminal Kiev clique afloat at a separate meeting that we requested for December 20th. Colleagues, according to a recent poll conducted by the American Institute of Public Opinion Gallup, more than half of Ukrainians are in favor of ending the conflict in the near future and are ready for inevitable territorial concessions. Knowing the bias of Western sociologists, there is every reason to believe that the real figure is much higher. The true mood in Ukrainian society is reflected in more than 100,000 deserters, and the absolute reluctance of Ukrainians to fight for an anti-human corrupt regime that has usurped power in Ukraine in defiance of the country's constitution. As well as the fact that Ukrainians, fleeing from the arbitrariness of the authorities, are massively seeking to move to Russia and return to the former Ukrainian territories that have become Russian subjects. Having caught these sentiments and received not at all encouraging signals from Washington, the head of the Kiev junta has recently noticeably lowered the bar of expectations. He is less and less advertising the victory plan, while gushing with all sorts of ideas about a potential settlement of the crisis. Such ostentatious peacefulness should not mislead anyone, since they are all united by the fact that, firstly, they are rehashes of the so-called Zelensky formula, and secondly, they are unrealizable in practice, since they do not eliminate the root causes of the Ukrainian crisis. In fact, all of them, as well as the reasoning of a number of reshod Western politicians, boil down to freezing the conflict along the line of contact, with the refusal of the territories that joined Russia and security guarantees for the square in the changed borders. The last wish of the man in the green sweatshirt is to receive from Joe Biden, before he leaves the White House, an invitation to NATO for the entire territory of Ukraine within internationally recognized borders, in which the alliance's guarantees would apply to the part that Ukraine will control with future expansion. Leaving aside the inadequacy of this rich debut idea, we would like to remind you once again that no schemes to freeze the conflict will suit Russia. Using the example of the Minsk agreements, we are fully convinced that neither the West nor the Kiev junta can be trusted, and we are well aware that the purpose of this exercise is to give the Kiev regime a much-needed respite on the battlefield in order to rearm and lick its wounds. There can be no question of any role for NATO in resolving the Ukrainian crisis. The alliance and the prospect of Ukraine's membership in it have been part of the problem from the very beginning, not part of the solution. When analyzing this new thinking that has suddenly manifested itself in the overdue Ukrainian authorities, we urge everyone to rely not on words, but on deeds. And here everything is absolutely obvious. By its actions, the Kiev regime continues to choose the path of confrontation and raising the stakes. This is clearly evidenced by the ongoing strikes with Western high-precision weapons, including those carried out on December 11th and 13 against military facilities in Taganrog and Orel with long-range Western missiles. Let me remind you how Donald Trump recently assessed these escalatory actions of Zelensky in an interview with Time magazine. Calling his decision stupid and a serious escalation, he said, "I strongly disagree with launching missiles hundreds of miles deep into Russia. Why are we doing this? We are just fueling this war and making the situation worse." I hope that our American colleagues will comment on these words of their president-elect today. The reluctance of the overdue Ukrainian leadership to move towards peace was also manifested in the rejection of Hungary's proposal to establish a Christmas ceasefire and exchange prisoners. For our part, on the same day, we handed over the list for exchange, but Zelensky, in his characteristic boorish manner, categorically rejected this initiative, once again refusing to take more than 600 Ukrainian servicemen who have been in Russia for more than a year. It is no secret that ordinary Ukrainians who got to the front due to forced mobilization are not interested in the Kiev regime. They are ready to exchange only militants of nationalist battalions, as well as foreign mercenaries who took part in hostilities against Russia. To conclude the topic of pseudo-peace initiatives of the overdue, we would like to remind you that despite all this, he has not yet canceled his decree of November 2022 banning negotiations with the Russian leadership. So draw your own conclusions about the sincerity of his statements and appeals. We do not rule out that this is just a smokescreen before another escalation, as was already the case in July and August of this year, before the invasion of Ukrainian militants and looters in the Kursk region. Madam President, we would like to take advantage of our meeting and draw the attention of our colleagues in the Security Council to the incident that occurred with the car of the IAEA Secretariat. On December 10th, during the planned rotation of the agency's experts at the Zaporizhzhia NPP, the armed forces of Ukraine attacked the vehicles involved in the transportation of personnel. A Russian convoy returning after delivering experts to the line of contact was also attacked. Fortunately, there were no casualties. During the rotations, and this was already the 25th, Russia undertook to ensure the ceasefire and gave security guarantees to employees. Ukraine has repeatedly violated these obligations, in particular in June and November last year, as well as in April of this year. IAEA fact sheet. No 264 clearly states that the incident occurred when personnel were traveling through Ukrainian-controlled territory to the point where they were supposed to cross the contact line. The driver saw that the drone was approaching from behind, that is, from the north, where Ukrainian formations are located. Let me clarify that this happened on the eve of the opening of an extraordinary session of the IAEA Board of Governors, convened by the Ukrainian side. We strongly condemn this provocation by the Kiev regime, which endangered the employees of the international organization and the Russian military personnel who are ensuring the rotation. We call on international organizations and the international community to condemn yet another flagrant violation of IHL by Ukraine. Madam President, in conclusion, I would also like to comment on the outrageous episode related to the verdict handed down on December 10, 2024, by the Solomiansky Court of Kiev against Ukrainian human rights activist Elena Berezhnaya. This world-famous 70-year-old civil anti-fascist activist was sentenced to 14 years in prison with confiscation of property, and before that, she was detained and tortured in a pre-trial detention center for more than 2.5 years. Let me remind you that the Volodymyr Zelensky regime opened a criminal case immediately after her speech at an informal meeting of the UN Security Council organized by Russia under the ARIA formula on December 22, 2021. And the basis of her sentence was a letter she wrote to the UN, which I quoted on March 28, 2022, during a meeting of the General Assembly. In other words, the Kiev regime is cracking down on a man before our eyes for speaking at our invitation to the UN and writing a letter to our organization criticizing the human rights situation in Ukraine. I wonder if today any of our Western colleagues, who in other situations are actively concerned about the safety of the rapporteurs invited to the UN, have at least a drop of conscience and civic courage to give an honest assessment of these actions of Zelensky and his clique. Colleagues, we hope that those of you who really want peace in Ukraine will have no illusions after our speech today about what Zelensky and his clique are really trying to achieve and how far they are from bringing peace to their country. They are ready to sacrifice all their citizens, mobilize women and children to stay in power, and avoid punishment for crimes against their people. But the end of the criminal and greedy regime is near. Its fronts are bursting at all seams. The territory under its control is shrinking every day, and the citizens of Ukraine are increasingly advocating peace and refusing to go to war. Our conditions for ending the conflict are clear and logical and have nothing to do with those surrogate formulas that do not eliminate the threat posed by the Kiev regime to Russia, which have recently been increasingly put forward by Kiev's Western allies. While this is happening, we will continue to achieve the goals of our NWO militarily and respond to the provocations of the Kiev regime as we did on December 13th. Thank you for your attention.